I think we can begin.
Okay, can you see me? Can you hear me? Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. My name is Francesco Cappelletti, and on behalf of the European Liberal Forum, the political foundation and think tank of the European Liberals and the ALDE Party, welcome to this fourth and last webinar organized by ELF with the support of our friends of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, together with We Are Innovation and GPS, the group of producing countries from the Southern Cone. We're going to talk about the free trade agreement in between the EU and Mercosur countries, nations. It has been taken more than 20 years to discuss. It's the largest free trade area that EU has ever created. However, it also has been contested as it has been discussed during the previous webinars of this series, where our speakers have been talking about protectionism, food security, and the connection between the free trade and the environment. So all those elements are posing some challenges for the implementation of this FTA between the EU and Mercosur. However, we believe that given the EU sustainable objectives and the Green Deal, the EU itself has the opportunity to leverage its trade power and we can say a sort of climate diplomacy, which is very much connected with the EU regulatory power and soft power EU. So the European Commission has the opportunity to use the legal instruments to guarantee both a strong trade, sustainable development, and the commitments for and from the Mercosur countries. We live in a time of crisis and tensions, and this is an opportunity to tackle multiple issues for climate change, while at the same time improving the well-being of millions who relies upon peace, security, and shared prosperity. Without any further ado, and looking forward to the discussion, asking the question where the EU-Mercosur FTA is going and why does it matter, which is the title of our series, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Arantxa Gomez from Northumbria University, who will run the webinar in a form of interview talk show with Martin Piñeiro, which is the chair of the Committee on Agrarian Affairs of CARI. Thank you all for joining us during this webinar journey and enjoying the final discussion today.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this webinar. It's a pleasure to discuss this topic. And as Francesco has said, we'll be moderating it in a sort of flexible way. First, we will have Dr. Martin Piñeiro presenting a few ideas on the topic, and then we will start a sort of discussion, open discussion, where I will present some questions, but also we will open the floor to questions from the audience. You have two channels to listen to us. You have one in English, and then you have a live translation channel into Spanish. If you have any questions about it, please use the chat function, and our colleagues will help you to select the right channel. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce our main speaker today, Dr. Martin Piñeiro, who is the chair of the Committee on Agriculture of the Argentine Council of International Relations in Argentina. He is also a member of the GPS network, a special advisor to the FAO DG, and a special advisor to EECAS, the basically Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. Previously, he was Undersecretary for Agriculture in Argentina, Director General of the, again, Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, Member Board of Trustees and Chair of Program Committee of the International Service for Agricultural Research, and Board Chair for International Food Policy Research Institute. He has published 10 books and more than 100 papers about agricultural development, policies, and institutional development, and on international agriculture and trade. Dr. Piñeiro holds a PhD from University of California and is a graduate from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. I believe Dr. Piñeiro is going to share his PowerPoint with us.
Right now, you mean?
Yes, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Okay. Bueno, good morning for everybody in Latin America and good afternoon for those in Europe. Thank you very much for the invitation to the Patty Ashton Forum. It's a pleasure to be here. I will make a presentation with a PowerPoint, which I will share in a minute, presenting some basic ideas on the agreement Mercosur Unión Europea, but mainly trying to put the attention in some of the difficulties that we are having now and some ideas that we should entertain to progress into the ratification of the agreement. And that's the basic elements of the presentation that have the main objective of generating a dialogue between all the participants. So let me go into sharing the presentation. Okay. I would like to, okay. Bueno, let me start by saying that the agreement is obviously a very important bi-regional agreement, maybe the most important that there is. It involves 800 million people and 24% of the global GDP. It would be a major thing if both regions could work together and increase its trade and its political and cooperation in general. And the thing is that the agreement has two pillars, as everybody knows: a trade, which has been agreed in principle and it was finalized in July 219, and then a political dialogue and cooperation agreement, or a pillar, which has a text, not many people know about that has tentatively been agreed in June 20, sorry, there's a mistake there. But it has not been made public. So not many people know of that it has been tentatively agreed. There's a text that has been tentatively agreed, and not many people know about the context. And of course, the trade pillar has been always considered as the most important, and probably it is, at least for the private sector. My presentation will concentrate in showing some of the difficulties of why the trade agreement is not being ratified, and presenting some ideas leading to how I think we could progress into finalizing this agreement. Let me say that in my mind, the agreement has a tremendous importance for both regions, including in the context of the new ideas of the Green Deal, and even more so, the strategic autonomy that is being discussed in Europe. But unfortunately, since 2019, when the trade agreement was signed or was tentatively agreed, nothing has happened. My interpretation is that there are some additional little things that need to be discussed, like, for example, geographic indicators and a few other minor things that are there that need some additional discussions. But there are things that most people think that can be finally agreed. There will not be stumbling blocks. They have been a difficulty, but not a stumbling block. But there are three things that I think are stumbling blocks, which have to do mainly with, of course, the agricultural issues. And I would like to talk specifically on the three of them, because in my mind, they're sort of resolving by themselves, by reasons that have nothing to do really with the negotiation in itself. And let me say, I will go over the main three difficulties. This first main difficulty. And originally, it was the main one. Now I think it might be not the main one, but it's still a very important one, which is that European agricultures, farmers, but also related economic and political interests, fear agricultural imports from Mercosur, fear competition. And let me say that it is really a little bit surprising that and vexing for us, because if you look at the agriculture producer support that countries receive, look what happened with most of the European countries. Very high, of course, Norwegian and top, but OECD, like number 5 or 6, very substantive. Almost 20% of total income comes through subsidies for the agricultural farmers, the European farmers, come from subsidies. What happens in Brazil? Very little. Uruguay and Paraguay, even less. They're not in the graph, but they almost don't have subsidies. Look, Argentina, minus 30%. The collection of policies that Argentina applies imply that they take away from the farmers 30% of the income they would have with a neutral policy. So Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay are competing with European farmers under these very negative conditions. So it is surprising that there's so much resistance. But anyway, there it is. Now, I have the feeling that this problem, this resistance, might start weakening, because there's a second graph I want to show that, of course, Europe was a main net importer before Brexit. After Brexit, Europe, 27 countries, is mainly a net exporter of agriculture. In addition, agricultural exports from Mercosur are decreasing in the last 10 years. This does not include the impact of Brexit. The whole figure is worked over Europe, 27 countries. Not including Great Britain or UK. So if this trend continues, it is likely to continue, well, imports will not really be that important for Europe, and thus some of the resistance maybe will disappear. Let me say that this perception is shared by authorities in the European Union. The international representative of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, was here about 2 weeks ago. And here he made different statements, and here I quote, it's almost a quote, that said, the European Union does not need the agriculture export from Mercosur. We are now, can more or less think of being self-sufficient. And as I showed in the graph, he might be right, because the agricultural exports follow the trend of the last 10 years. Well, the importance of our agriculture export to Europe might decrease. Of course, I think that Borrell was a little bit exaggerating, because there are a number of goods like grass-fed beef, animal feed, and progressively, of course, green energy, minerals like lithium, that will be very significant and will provide a new trade relationship between the two regions. But let me also emphasize that if the agricultural exports diminish and greatly diminish and becoming significant, then also Mercosur might be losing interest in the agreement, because what would be the trade advantages for Mercosur if it's not agricultural exports? As most of you know, agricultural exports represent for Mercosur more than half. In Argentina, 60% or more. In Uruguay and Paraguay, 70 or more. In Brazil, a little bit less, but more than 50%. So if agricultural exports diminish to an insignificant quantity, then the regional agreement loses a lot of importance for us. Now, and consequently, Europe might need to think on additional incentives. It might be energy in 10 years, once we get our act together and become heavy exporters. It might be lithium, it might be other things. It might be non-tangible things like information, etc. We'll have to see. But some other incentives might be needed to generate sufficient interest in the Mercosur. Second difficulty, the sustainability of Mercosur agriculture in the European perception. Let me say that, contrary to what is widely thought, Mercosur agriculture is very sustainable. There is lack of information and a lot of misunderstanding. Most of the agriculture in Mercosur is done using technologies like zero-till, very low use of fertilizers and chemicals, year-long cattle grazing, which implies very low contributions to climate, negative contributions to climate change, because carbon circulates between what is captured by the grass and then liberated by the cows. So the final impact is very low. There is abundant literature about that, that shows that, and that is becoming recognized internationally. And I think that there is a subject that we need a lot of dialogue with Europe, so that we understand on both sides exactly what is the situation. We need to work, we need to generate data, and we need to have a dialogue. 2 days ago, the Argentine embassy in Brussels sustained a seminar where a lot of information was presented, and that information is available, and maybe some of you could be interested in seeing it. In addition, in the recent COP27, it was amply recognized that the contribution of agriculture, when agriculture is done in a sustainable manner, is a very low contributor to climate change, and that the real problem, as we all know, is fossil energy. And then the energy transition that Europe has initiated, it's a major part of the discussion. Of course, Europe has initiated it in a very difficult moment because of the war with Ukraine, but that needs an overall and global discussion and cannot be just a discussion maintained in Europe. It needs to be globalized. The third difficulty is deforestation. And here, yes, we do have a problem. We have an objective problem. However, let me say that in Mercosur, of course, the responsibilities are not even. Uruguay has no responsibility in deforestation. Brazil has a lot. Paraguay and Argentina, something is happening there, some responsibility there. But let me emphasize that the newly elected government in Brazil has made or is making very strong commitments on that they will take that theme very seriously. And that provides a new opportunity, not only for dialogue, but also to resolving the problem. But let me emphasize a more conceptual thing. I think, and I think that many people are beginning to say the same thing, are beginning to argue in the same direction, that deforestation is an issue that should not be dealt within trade agreements, and that regulatory standards on production chains is not the appropriate solution. It has enormous costs, it complicates a lot, it will inhibit multilateral agricultural trade, and will in the end have will not actually resolve the problem. Deforestation is a subject that requires dialogue and joint collaboration, and the joint collaboration will need some funding from the developed countries to the developing countries. And there's a long discussion that was incorporated in the COP27 and actually was the main argument behind the agreement on the new funding for losses, which mainly implies historical losses, not only actual losses. So it's a compensation for the deforestation that took place in some of the developed countries through many years and centuries ago in regards to the deforestation that is happening today in some of the developing countries. And that needs an overall agreement, at least regional agreements, but probably a world agreement. But anyway, there are some examples in that direction. In the last year or two, things have moved in that direction, not only conceptually, but also in a practical terms. Examples of that is the South-South Rainforest Leadership Alliance made by Brazil, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Indonesia, that was talked about a lot in COP27. All the proposals made by President Macron and Prime Minister Sunak under the name of Forest and Climate Leadership Partnership, where the structure of those agreements, the logic behind those agreements is countries get together to dialogue how the deforestation problems in each one of the countries needs to be addressed, what are the policies, and what is the funding and where the funding will come to take the necessary measures. There's a very complex subject that will need a lot of discussions and very difficult agreements, but I have very strong feeling that that's the only way of doing it. Now, given this, it is likely, the summary of what I said, I think that those three main difficulties are evolving in the right way, are evolving because conditions and new political conditions, that they will tend to resolve by themselves, and that the trade pillar will be able or might be able to be agreed definitely and signed by both regions, by the countries in both regions. However, and beyond the pillar, I have the feeling that the political dialogue and cooperation pillar has always been very important, but now, under the present geopolitical context, is beginning to be, maybe, in my mind, the major pillar. Because the war has accentuated, leading to a very complex and conflictive world. We're not living in the world that we had 5 or more so 10 years ago, before the crisis in 2008, where globalization was growing very rapidly and very independently of political constraints. Now, after the war, actually after some trends that started with climate change, COVID-19, but now very strongly with the invasion to Ukraine, the world is decoupling. Main countries, large economies are decoupling, mainly the United States and Europe from China and Russia, but also many other countries. Furthermore, Europe and the United States, in the words of many leading persons like Janet Yellen or Mrs. Lagarde or Mr. Borrell, have been pushing for the concept of nearshoring that had already started with the climate change discussions 4 or 5 years ago, but now also with the friendshoring idea, that is creating or building up the global or the production chains, not with everybody and not independently of the geopolitical context, but giving privilege to the countries that are friends, meaning friends, have similar government conditions, believe in democracy, have democratic governments, and believe in human rights. This is a new context, and in this new context, there are, I think, very new and very strong economic incentives and also political incentives for the integration of both of Europe and Latin America that have historical, political, cultural, and historical ties. I think that progressing and agreeing finally in the political dialogue on cooperation pillar would provide the basis, the institutional basis, for really progressing in an economic integration, leading to stronger cooperation, the construction of bi-regional production chains, including, very importantly, agriculture, and becoming a niche for export to the rest of the world. This implies technological transition, investments by the private sector, and probably agreed common policies on certain elements. I think that this is a major thing, which was important before, but becomes very substantial and very urgent in the new geopolitical context. So, final remarks. Sort of a little summary of the main ideas. The trade agreement is important for mainly for, I think, for Mercosur, is a major incentive for Mercosur. And I think that the difficulties that Europe has put forward are evolving and diluting. And in addition, some effort and some generosity might be needed from some of the European countries, and especially, of course, France, which is a country that is exercising the major restrictions. But a part of that, in addition to that, we need to think in the political and economic integration of both regions. It is a major element, I think, not so much of, it could be for the Green Deal, but it is, I think, it could be a major element of the strategic autonomy idea and concept that is beginning to be discussed in Europe. Because it doesn't need to be only Europe. It has to be in connection with the countries that are historical friends. Europe cannot survive alone in a very complex and conflictive world if, unfortunately, we go in that direction. Europe needs Latin America in that confrontation. And of course, we also need Europe to survive in that very difficult world. So, in my mind, we need to work very much in the trade agreement, but also in the other pillar. And we need to work on both together, and it is urgent that we really do so and reach a final agreement. Thank you very much. And of course, I'll be happy to try to have a dialogue and respond questions or disagreements. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin Piñeiro. It's been a fantastic presentation, and I already have a few points I would like to discuss with you. I'm going to start with a few questions, and in the meantime, if anyone would like to add their own questions on the chat function, you can do it either in English or in Spanish. And as soon as they're ready, obviously, I will give you the floor. In the meantime, let's start our own conversation, Martin. So I will start with the first point that you made in relation to the three key issues. The first one was in relation to farmers, right? And I would like to link that to the point that Joseph Borrell made about, I want to quote him directly, the EU does not need the agricultural exports from Mercosur, right? And I was wondering if you could discuss this, bringing the political aspect, because there is a difference between the EU does not need and the EU does not want. Because if there is, we have those concerns within Europe, in some European countries at least, France, of course, but Poland, also Ireland, and in some parts of Spain. If the concerns are there, it's because agricultural products, the farms in Mercosur are extremely competitive. And without the common agricultural policy, without the subsidies that you mentioned, European countries will not be in a position to compete with those products, right? So to what extent, I guess my question comment is, to what extent this is not an economic discussion, but a political discussion? And to what extent this is simply an issue about protectionism, which goes against the idea of the EU does not need Mercosur products, it doesn't want, what I will say, because, and I would like to link this to the current crisis that we have in Europe in terms of inflation and energy bills, etc. In other words, if you were offering consumers cheaper agricultural products, certainly many people will choose them. So I guess that my question or comment, if it makes sense, what I'm saying is, to what extent protectionism and the common agricultural policy, which is supported by basically farmers at national level, is the real issue here, instead of discussing the competitiveness of Mercosur products? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Arantxa. It's a difficult question and might require a little bit long answer, but I will try to be short. Of course, it's both things. It's an economic and a political issue. The economic issue, this is the reason why I showed the graph. Europe can probably be almost self-sufficient in agriculture. As I said, there are some things that you might not be able to do, and you will need always some meat, grass-fed meat, and you will need some feeding materials for your livestock, etc., etc. But of course, the requirements will be could be little, and this is why imports from Mercosur are actually decreasing. But of course, that happens because you have this level of subsidies, OECD here showed in the graph, while we have this negative subsidies. So of course, consumers could be fed much cheaply through imports. And that's beyond discussion. Now, there's a second level of argument saying, yes, but agriculture in Mercosur is not sustainable, and then the imports might be bad for climate change and things like that. Well, that's not necessarily true. As I said, agriculture leaving deforestation out, beyond deforestation, agriculture is very sustainable, very sustainable. Contributions to contamination and contribution to CO2 from our agriculture is much less than the one in Europe. And there's a lot of measurements in regards to that. So, you know, there's a concept of repurposing of subsidies. If the subsidies of the subsidies you have already in Europe and the ones that you're thinking in regards to the Green Deal were distributed in the world, they would be much more effective in terms of sustainability, world sustainability. Actually, if they remained only in Europe and concentrated only in instruments that have to do with climate change and sustainability, they would be much more effective in regards to sustainability, climate change, or what they are at present. So you would have to make very substantive changes in the structure of your subsidies. Now, politics are politics, of course, and we all know that. So, of course, Europe cannot make a change tomorrow. What I think Europe should think is making a transition, a long-term transition that would take 10 or 15 years, in the direction that you did when you instituted the decoupling 10 or 15 years ago. You had a very bad structure of subsidies. You introduced the concept of decoupling. It improved greatly. Maybe now you have to make a second step, making additional decoupling and concentrating in those subsidies that have to be directed to climate change. And we would be happier because your contribution to climate change would be much higher, but production would decrease. And then we could still have more trade between the two regions, and actually your consumers would be benefiting because prices would go down.
Excellent. Yes, very good points. Let's open up a bit more the discussion in terms of the political aspect. Argentina apparently could be in the future a supplier of gas, apparently. You also have, I believe, the largest amount of lithium in the region. In the region you have the largest amount of lithium around the world. And that's something that the US, as well as China, as the EU, is interested in. So I guess my question is there a fear of developing again a sort of primarization of trade, in the sense of becoming one more time the providers of primary sources, natural resources, instead of focusing on other industries and sectors. What's your perception or view on the idea that several countries want to keep Mercosur countries as just providers of natural resources?
Well, I really don't believe that countries have a clear and defined strategy for keeping countries producing only primary materials. That is the result of many other things. Of course, the policies of developed countries, policies of us, of developing countries. So it's a mixture of conditions, and as a result also of the difficulties, because for a country like Argentina, it's very difficult to integrate its economy, including processed industries, because you have to compete with other countries that are ahead of us in the developing process and that are also very competitive. And I'm not talking about Europe or the United States, I'm talking about South Korea or even China or Vietnam. So we have to compete with those countries. So it is also very difficult, but not impossible. And we do have to work in that direction. But you mentioned energy and lithium. I think that if I was a European, I would be thinking, how can I do and how can I assure that Argentina really develops, and Brazil really develop, and Bolivia, which is not Mercosur, but almost is an associated country. How we assure that they develop fully their gas production, so that they become our suppliers now that we will never buy gas again from Russia. Now we have the basic material, the basis. We need capital to develop them rapidly, which we don't. So there's a marvelous situation. The same with lithium. Of course, we should negotiate that. And we should negotiate, and we Argentina, we should negotiate in a way in which we keep a much larger part of the final gain of that. And maybe in lithium, we should be sure that we also produce the batteries. But there's no reason why Europe would not want to do that, at least in a mixture. And this is why I emphasize so much the pillar of political dialogue and cooperation, because that would be the institutional couch to provide the investments, the technological transfer, and the integration of value chains between the two regions. So it's a great opportunity, not a difficulty.
Yes, it's an advantage, more disadvantage. I agree. Could we talk perhaps a bit more about the future more than the present? The Spanish presidency is going to take place in 2023. And for the last couple of years, there have been many meetings between different parts of this agreement, the association agreement between Mercosur and the European Union. And in particular, many meetings between representatives of Spain and also, obviously, meetings with the High Representative, Josep Borrell. I know it's difficult to predict the future, but considering what we just discussed, everything, and considering what is going on with Ukraine and all the crises that the EU is trying to deal with at the moment, and considering the fact that this agreement will have to be ratified by, obviously, all EU countries and approved by EU institutions, etc., and that in 2024 we will have elections in the European Parliament, and there will be a change of the European Commission To what extent do you think that it truly is possible to finalize the agreement during the Spanish presidency? Because on one side, people can look at all those things and say, well, this is the best time, because otherwise, with a change of European Parliament and a change of governments across Europe becoming more protectionist and more populist, then it's going to be more difficult. But other people could say putting pressure on an agreement is never a good idea, and certainly not an agreement of this size, of this importance. So on which side do you see yourself, on the optimistics or on the maybe more pessimistic? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm a very optimistic person, so I've always will have an optimistic view. But more practically, we do have some optimism, not only me, but I mean, I think in Latin America, that 23 will offer a possibility, because Spain, who is one of the countries, or maybe the country that is more in favor of the agreement, will be, as you said, will have the presidency. And in our side, it will be Brazil. And there's great indications that the Lula government will be also quite anxious in finalizing the agreement. So you would have two presidents and two countries which are powerful, especially Brazil is very powerful and influential in Mercosur because it's very large. Spain has quite an influence in Europe. So there, I think we do have an opportunity. But let me make also a concept. I introduce a concept, which I said something before. You know, you're starting to discuss the strategic autonomy concept. And I think that in the present geopolitical situation, it is a very important concept. But let me say one thing. United States, without having defined that in written very strictly, has strategic autonomy. But how are they reacting now under the new situation, the very complex situation? They're not thinking themselves as a tower. The first thing they did was construct all the alliances with the hard core of the basic alliance they've always had. The first thing the Biden government did was establish relationship with Japan, strengthen the relationship with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, etc. They were very strongly working with India for good reasons we can discuss. So if Europe is thinking about a strategic autonomy, thinking of themselves as a fortress, I think that's a big mistake, because Europe is very large and very important, and is becoming a rule maker in many aspects, especially in agricultural trade. But it's not sufficiently powerful to have strategic autonomy by themselves. They need alliances with their friends. And Latin America is one of the basic historical and cultural friends.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that because of might seem like an excuse, and probably it is an excuse, but because of the amount of crisis that Europe has had since 2007, since 2008, sorry, since the beginning of the financial crisis, then the migration crisis, obviously now the crisis, the war on Ukraine, and Brexit was a crisis also, and the level of populism and Euroscepticism across Europe. I think that there is a look towards, inwards look in European Union. They are or we are not looking outwards as a way of resolving our problems, which I think, in my opinion, is what we should do. Look for alliances and cooperation outside the Europe basically. Before I give you my last question, I would like to double check that there are no questions in the chat function. As far as I know, there are no questions, but if there are questions there, please, Francesco, let me know. Or Ola. actually, there is just one question here from Camila Basket. I'm going to read it aloud. I'm confused. Since you say Latin America has a better sustainable development in agriculture than Europe, but Europe should help Latin America with technological tools to have better results. Will the worst sustainable region help the better one, or did I get that wrong? Martin?
I don't think it's a contradiction. I'm just saying that we do have a very sustainable agriculture, and there's a lot of scientific information and results that indicate that. But there's always space for dialogue and exchange of technologies. I'm not saying that necessarily we are better in everything, and as I'm also saying that Europe is not better in everything. So there's a lot of possibilities of exchange of information. Europe has a lot of scientific capacities, and you have done a lot of work in the relationship between agriculture and climate change and sustainability in general. And of course, we can both benefit from dialogue and contributions. And I would say Europe has more science and technologies than Latin America. We have a more sustainable agriculture because we have very ample resources. And because the ample resources, we can do an agriculture, a more extensive agriculture that is safer from a climate change point of view, or a sustainability point of view. And one little example, Argentina uses less than half of fertilizers and chemicals than Europe, because in extensive agriculture and zero tilling, you can do that. If you use zero tilling, you can use much less fertilizers and chemicals. So nothing is so absolute.
Thank you so much for that. Now, we are going to have only 2 minutes left before we need to wrap up the session and finish it. So I think that I would like to give you the floor for the last time, Martin, in case you would like to say any final comments, or if you want to pose questions out there for the audience of myself to think about, or what is going to happen in the future, things to keep in mind.
Yes. No, I mean, just to emphasize what I think is my main point and my main actually personal concern, which is in regards to this agreement, I think we are disagreeing on things that in the end are little things. For example, we are arguing about geographic indicators. Well, I think that's it's important for some people, some industries, and maybe we should think on a way of compensating them appropriately. But in the end, are relatively minor elements. We are in a moment in which the world is facing a very complex and difficult situation. And I think is a moment of being generous, not pay attention to the small things, or find solutions to the small things, and define strategies that respond to the big picture and the real strong menaces, dangers. And I think that Europe and Latin America jointly could face those problems much better than independently.
Yes, I think we should focus on what we have in common more than focusing on what we don't have in common, especially in the current context, and especially considering, in my opinion anyway, that things are not going to get better anytime soon. We still have a few difficult years ahead. And with that, I guess that it's time to wrap up the session. And I would like to start saying thank you to Ola in particular and Francesco for hosting us, for having us today. And my biggest thank you is to you, Martin. It's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion with you. And I really hope that we continue with this kind of conversations. I think they're very important. They are very educative, if I say so, if I'm allowed to say so. I think they are really extremely relevant for obvious reasons, and they have to take place. And it's an absolutely pleasure to know that this is taking place in 2 languages at the same time, because obviously we reach more people. And I would like to thank to our translators for their job, which is a difficult one, very difficult one, live translation. And it's been an absolute pleasure to be part of this. I believe, let me check very quickly.
Thank you, Arantxa, because you've been a very good moderator. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the messages on the chat function. And with that, I think that's all from us. Thank you very much. Have a lovely week, everyone. And hopefully we'll see you sort of virtually soon. Bye-bye.